Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time out today. We're really delighted to be here. I'm really pleased to kick off our final session of the 2020-2021 Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host today, Lauren Cooper. I lead the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University, and I'm on the steering committee of the Forest Climate Working Group. We are pleased to lead the Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. And for those that are unfamiliar, we call this the FCWG, is a diverse group of forest interests with now over 60 members that have been working together for over a decade. That includes landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. So feel free to check out the FCWG website if you're interested to learn more. But to get to today's speakers, I am really pleased to introduce Darren Sleep, the Senior Director of Conservation Strategies with SFI, or the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and Betty Cremens, the lead of the OneT.org North American sector with the World Economic Forum. They will give a presentation today titled Private Sector Investments and Assurances for Climate Smart Forestry. So really excited to have this kind of higher level outlook to wrap up the whole year of speakers. So thanks so much for our speakers for giving the time today. So today's session will explore the intersection of forests, the business community, and climate change mitigation. And as many of us know, the private sector is increasingly concerned with addressing climate change, including through net zero commitments. And this is placing a new focus on sustainable wood products and major interventions like large scale reforestation. So we'll look forward to learning from our speakers today on what that looks like for them. But before I hand it over, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping details. To automatically receive registration details about upcoming webinars, and again, this is the last one for the 2020-2021 series, but we will be announcing a new lineup for the upcoming year shortly. So if you'd like more information about this or to be kind of in the loop, feel free to email us at forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. The session is being recorded, so this is a common question. You will have access to the recording after the event, along with any supplemental materials, such as the presentation slides or links to resources mentioned today. So if you've registered, you'll receive an update letting you know when that happens, but you can find that at the FCCP website as well in our open resource library. And on the slide here, you'll see a couple notes on Q&A. So we all know how to submit chat and questions at this point on Zoom, but you can really use either. We'll track both. We do encourage you to use the Q&A just because we can more easily keep track of them afterwards, but we would encourage you to put in questions at any point during during both speakers, because it can be hard to remember them at the very end. So feel free to put in any questions that come up, smaller clarifications to bigger questions, and we'll organize these and have a nice Q&A session at the end. So again, really encourage you to put your questions in as they pop up, but we'll hold all questions to a discussion at the end. And if you are calling in on the phone, but you have access to email, you can email questions to forestc@msu.edu. And we often have outstanding questions now. So in the case of outstanding questions, we'll work with the speakers to have these addressed, and we'll post them as a PDF document along with the recording of the webinar as well. So to get back to our speakers, I will hand it off. We're gonna start with Darren today, then move over to Betty, and I'll be back for the discussion. So thanks so much. I'll hand it over to you, Darren.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. And thanks to the organizers for inviting SFI to give this presentation. We're really looking forward to an interesting discussion and thinking about things at a higher level, at a sort of a corporate level. And with that, I'd like to talk to you today about climate smart forestry and SFI's new revised standard and the new requirements within that those revisions. Now, for those of you who may not be fully familiar with SFI, we are a conservation organization whose vision is a world simply that values and benefits from sustainably managed forests, with this driving mission to advance sustainability through forest-focused collaborations. We do this in many ways. I'll get into some of those. But we are a three-chambered board. You can see economic, environmental, and social organizations. This is a CEO-led board, so CEOs of these organizations sit on our board and give us direction and help us get where we're trying to go. And although we may be best known perhaps for the SFI forest management and fiber sourcing standards, we have these 4 pillars of work that we work in to make it a much more broadly impactful organization. So we do have obviously our Sustainable Forestry Initiative standards, but we also have an educational program, particularly through PLT, Project Learning Tree, and Project Learning Tree Canada, that develops curriculum for kids K to 12 that really focuses on getting kids connected with the forest around them, reinforcing the things that we want kids to know through education anyway, be it math and reading and writing and that sort of thing, but really putting it into a nature-based context. We also have our community pillar, which works to connect communities to their forests, various connections through Boy Scouts of America or Habitat for Humanity or different organizations, particularly disenfranchised organizations that we help connect to the forest. And finally, where I hang my hat in the conservation pillar, where we do a lot of work around connecting the link between well-managed forests and the conservation benefits and ecosystem services that they provide. The SFI standard has been growing over the last few years. You can see here this trend line. We continue to get lots of interesting and interested buy-in to what we're doing because we are so broad-based and so effective at what we're doing. We cover, it's important to note that SFI is only found in North America in terms of the land that we certify with 370 million acres. That's a huge footprint in North America, but we are recognized globally for our label and what we do. We address multiple values through our standard, including thinking about biodiversity, water, and social elements as well. Today, I'll be talking a little bit more specifically about carbon and climate. But this scale we have allows SFI to be this major voice for responsible forest management and forest sourcing, not only in the US and Canada, where again, the land that we certify is found, but also globally. Now, we all know that climate change and carbon have become a driving force of sustainability these days, all the way right across the supply chain from customers all the way up to investors. You'll see this sort of reporting in the popular media and in other places almost daily now. The most recent being the impact essentially of carbon and climate concerns now hitting the oil and gas sector, which is some really interesting developments with some of the biggest players in that industry now being affected by these sustainability issues. Now, we've done some work looking at our customer base, and we're finding that we know that customers respond to this. They see this. They see that buying wood products from sustainably managed forests rather is a good way if you're thinking about combating climate change. And 72% say buying paper or cardboard products from sustainably managed forests is good if you're trying to combat climate change. So we know this is not just a flash in the pan. This is what customers are looking for. This is what investors are looking for. This is right across the supply chain. And we know this is important to tackle some of these very significant challenges that we're facing globally. So why climate change and carbon? Why is it so important? Well, first of all, with the ongoing concern around climate change and things sort of rapidly, in some cases, sort of beginning to spiral out of control, we know that this is a top of mind issue for a lot of people. We know that brand owners and companies have now put sustainability goals and or climate and carbon goals into their accountability, into their sustainability reporting. And of course, investment and ESG are now targeting climate and carbon metrics. So these things have become really important in what we're thinking. We also know that SFI certified companies are increasingly helping to mitigate that climate change effect through the use of our new standards that we've developed, which I'll get into in a minute. What this comes down to is we firmly believe that climate change and forest carbon can be positively affected through sustainably managed forests. We know that sustainably managed forests capture carbon quickly. We know they can store more carbon over the long term, and they will help us in the fight against climate change. We know this to be true. We know there is data out there to support this, but in some cases we have to push a little harder to get that data out so we can talk about it openly. And it's not us doing the work, but it's collaborative work we do with other organizations to bring that forward. Now, one way we do that at SFI is we have a requirement within the standard that companies who are certified to SFI must be engaged in collaborative forest research to inform that management. And some of that work goes into these, what we call our conservation impact touch points, these themes of climate change, biodiversity, and water. We have an annual report that we require our certified organizations to fill out and give us that information so we know what they've been doing throughout the year. And in this last year alone, we've got 19 different projects across our footprint in North America that are climate related. And here's the breakdown of the different categories that they've looked at. So, you know, we've got this requirement. Certified organizations are doing work to contribute towards, you know, getting better data on these issues. So this is fantastic. That's kind of the first step. But we take it another step beyond that. SFI has what we call our conservation impact project. I've already alluded to these three themes of climate change, biodiversity, and water. We really wanted to do some work, and we started this at in about 2016. We're doing this work to help really quantify the impact of sourcing from SFI and SFI certified forests, as well as the SFI fiber sourcing standard, and is really designed to help certified organizations and their customers understand the positive impact of sourcing from sustainably managed forests. This is important for conservation stakeholders, you know, outside of the supply chain, to better understand the value of certification and why it's important and why we have all these requirements. And on top of that, we take this information and we can use it to facilitate continual improvement of SFI through this deeper, improved understanding and this new data that we're able to collect. Now, to give you some example of some of the works we've been doing, some recent collaborations on climate change and carbon. This is some work that we did with American Forest, one of our good partners, that looked at best management practices on SFI certified lands. So for example, slash retention, or putting slash being the branches and twigs and whatnot, putting slash down in skid trails to prevent compaction, that sort of thing. How are these things affecting soil carbon, for example, which is one of the aspects of forest carbon that is less understood. And this data shows that in terms of the loss of carbon in soils, forest harvesting is not the issue, but in fact, land use change is a much bigger issue, as well as catastrophic wildfire that can have a much deeper issue on carbon in soils. And we found that, and we're always trying to find a way to nudge that a little bit more to the positive. If we can find a way to develop BMPs that would actually enhance soil carbon, that would be fantastic. So this is the kind of the work that we're doing. We've also done similar work, if you will, with the University of Maine, looking at practices that can improve soils, that can protect soils better, that can maintain that carbon in them, or maybe even enhance carbon. So we've done a bunch of work with the University of Maine in some of their northern study sites in northern Maine, where they've looked at these different practices and how they affect soil compaction and how that in turn affects carbon in the soil. So this is some more collaborative work that we've been engaged with. In trying to understand SFI's footprint in terms of carbon, we've also been working in the US with the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, or NCASI, and in Canada, we've been working with NRCan, or Natural Resources Canada, and the Saskatchewan Research Council together to do an assessment of SFI's footprint in terms of the carbon that is present on that footprint and how much is sequestered over time. Now, it's an interesting contrast. If you look at the lower 48, where we've done the entire footprint, we found that the carbon stored is well over 20 billion tons. But in Canada, with only a 20% sample of the footprint in Canada, it's actually more than that, it's 22 billion tons. So there's a lot more carbon that we have yet to assess. And that's because in Canada, yes, I'm a proud Canadian, we have really deep carbon-rich soils that the US doesn't have in a lot of places. But then if you look to the carbon sequestered, it's a whole different story. We don't grow trees in Canada super duper fast. At 4.5 million tons sequestered annually, it pales in comparison to the amount of carbon that's sequestered in the US. For those of you who have spent time in the Southeast US, you can stand in a forest and you can almost hear the trees grow. They grow so fast, so it's quite amazing. So the dynamics are different, but we're working with these organizations to better understand what is in the carbon footprint within the SFI footprint at a North American scale. So we're really trying to get a handle on what's going on in the forest in terms of the carbon balance. Now, all this has led to some of this work being put into our standards revision. Now, the last, I guess it's 2 years now. In some cases, it seemed like it's gone by very quickly. In other cases, for some of our staff, I'm sure it's felt like a lifetime. We've gone through this standard revision process. So it's about a 2-year process. You can see where we are on this timeline. We are now in the PEFC endorsement process. So that's the program for the endorsement of forest certification in Europe so that we get recognized internationally. But we've gone through this long process. Now, you can imagine the plans for this entire standard revision process were massively impacted by COVID and the pandemic. And that isn't in fact the case. Because of the pandemic and the change, we've had to really take this online. We've had to pivot to a technological resource. We've had lots of revision task groups, lots of folks participating. We've had over 100 different participants from across the SFI community. So that's certified organizations, societal, environmental groups, community groups that have got involved with rewriting the standard, if you will, and develop this. And more importantly, and I think sort of more exciting, is the amount of participation we've had in providing comments and reviewing it. We've had about 10 different webinars focusing on these different key themes. We have had over 2,300 individuals and organizations that have participated in the webinars, submitted comments, and really gotten engaged. So we really feel like the standard revision has been this huge groundswell of community work across the forestry sector and conservation sector. So we're really happy with this work. The result is these improvements, these enhancements to the old standard. I'm only really going to focus today on 2 of them, but you can see there's a number of different ways we've addressed different issues, but it's right here in Objective 9 around climate smart forestry and Objective 10 around fire resilience and awareness that I really want to talk at least just briefly about today, and happy to answer more questions on later. So first, let's go to Objective 9 and look at climate smart forestry. So, this is sort of in some ways, it's a repeat of what I've already said. We know that forests play a critical role in addressing climate change, destroying carbon. They are a massive chunk of the carbon cycle on our planet. So it's important that we understand the role they play. There's this, as we said, an increasing global focus on climate, and increasing the understanding about forests certainly gives SFI this opportunity to play a very important role in this. Now, we also know that there are elements of the standard that were already in place prior to this revision that went a long way to addressing climate change through resiliency, reforestation, and forest health. Nonetheless, there was this driving sense at the very first meeting where we thought we might get some pushback on this. It was sort of everyone rolled up their sleeves and said, we have to do this. We really need to focus on this. And I recall one certified organization stood up in the room and said, we don't need to just consider this. We need a whole new objective dedicated to climate change. So this was that was the exciting part. The terrifying part was when they handed the pen to me and said, write us one and we'll work from there. So it was a really exciting moment for me. Now, to say that the SFI standard, the forest management standard, already addressed a lot of these elements, we actually did some work with Lauren Cooper and her team to look at the climate benefits of SFI forest certification. So this project looked at these 3 categories of impact within the SFI standard, looking at core concepts that are expressed in the initial standards. So this is the one prior to this. The category of management and carbon source, what's included there, and then this connection with best management practices. So we'd already done some work at that point to show that the SFI standard had these benefits baked into it already, which was great, but we really wanted to bring it to the top and focus on it a little bit more. So hence the climate smart forestry objective had 2 major components. The first is to ask certified organizations to identify climate risks, to look at, what are the things that are likely to happen on your landscape as a result of climate change? What are the things that are going to have a big impact? So you can sort of get a sense of where are the pinch points on your operations, where are the things that you really need to figure out a way to adapt, and then to develop an adaptation plan, to develop adaptation objectives and strategies to address those things that are most likely to impact your landscape. So I should say none of this was a cakewalk. It took a lot of work to figure out how to do this, and we're still developing guidance. We're still finding ways to provide more information to certified organizations as they take on this challenge. But I will say kudos to our certified organizations. There's been a lot of appetite to do this, so they're ready to go with this. The second element of the Climate Smart Forestry objective was to look at operations and say, where are the opportunities to mitigate climate-related impacts? Is there a chance here that, is there something I can do that might reduce my emissions? Is there something I might do to increase sequestration? So again, getting back to that BMP role in doing things better. So those are the two pieces of the objective. And of course, there are requirements within that certified organizations have to make. The second piece of standard that was important in this revision was this fire resilience and awareness objective. So, we know that the link between wildfires and a warming climate is well documented. We've seen this on the west coast of the US and in Canada. It's a very significant concern. And we knew that this increased incidence of wildfire, especially in certain places, had massive undesirable effects, both in terms of climate, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of threat to human health and human life. So we really wanted to make sure that this was addressed. So there's two pieces to this this objective, similar to the first one. It allows certified organizations to look at the land both that they manage as well as the communities that they surround, if you will. So on lands that they own or manage, we've asked certified organizations to try and limit susceptibility to these undesirable impacts of wildfire, to come up with fire management plans, fuel loading plans, to really think about how they can use their operations to increase forest resilience to these fires and to reduce fire incidents if at all possible. And of course, to support restoration of those forests following those damage events, those catastrophic wildfires that may happen. On the other hand, we've also asked certified organizations to engage in efforts to really raise awareness, to do some education, to take action towards the fire management and minimization of these undesirable effects. So to work not only in the forest, but in those communities to start instituting fire smart programs, if you will, to reduce the potential threat to the community. So it's these two pieces of new standard writing, these two objectives, the climate smart forestry, as well as the fire resilience and awareness, that we really think will help our certified organizations better represent the capacity they have to really make a difference when it comes to climate change and to creating that benefit to the community and to the planet that we know that they can do. And this does allow us to really think about the way we talk about our standard. We know that choosing certified sustainable products helps reduce carbon emissions. And now we've got not only the standard to do that, we've also got the science behind it to support these findings. So we're really excited about this going forward. There's no, I'm not going to say any of this is easy, either in terms of doing it as a certified organization or as, in terms of writing it and providing the guidance. It's a big step. It's taken a lot of work by a lot of people, but I'm really happy to have been involved with it. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone or hand the podium over to Betty, who will take it from here. Go ahead, Betty.
Thank you, Darren, and thank you as well to the organizers for inviting us both to speak. You will hear some common themes across both presentations, so hopefully that is a welcome opportunity to hear two very different programs who operate in quite a similar space and are all working towards similar objectives. So I'm thrilled to be here to share a little bit with you about OneT.org, the Trillium Trees platform and initiative of the World Economic Forum. I'm going to share a little bit about what OneT is, how we have come to begin to develop the business case for investing in conservation, restoration, and growing of trees towards our mission to restore 1 trillion trees over the coming decade. And then I'm going to give you a sneak peek at a report we're putting out actually this Friday. We'll be launching. We've co-written with Dahlberg Advisors on the business case for investing in forest, in case that can help you in your work in engaging with companies across all sectors. And then I've been asked by the organizers to go down a bit of a rabbit hole on net zero emissions targets. They seem to be, as Darren mentioned, all the rage right now. And I want to sort of try to demystify a little bit about net zero so you can feel confident in when you're speaking with companies about their climate goals and understand how conservation and restoration of forests can help companies meet these objectives. So we'll start with what is OneT if you're not familiar with us. And these slides in the beginning are the typical slides we use when we engage with any company or any government across the world. But I wanted to keep them in, not to teach you probably anything you know, but to make sure that you understand that as OneT.org was launched last year, we really recognize the incredible expertise, the incredible passion, and the diversity of perspectives in this sector. And we want to make sure that as we enter and as we create this global movement around this work, that we're pulling on all of the expertise across the world and we're driving everyone forward faster together. So when we present OneT, we always recognize the incredibly important role that forests, that healthy forests, I should say, play in all sorts of economic and environmental and social areas. So, you know, as Darren very, very eloquently described, there are natural carbon sinks, biodiversity protectors, filtering water and air, and all these really important ecosystem services that sometimes we take for granted and we're increasingly learning to value. We also know that we're globally losing forests at an unprecedented rate. In spite of all of the best efforts around conservation and restoration, we've lost over half of the 6 trillion trees that used to populate this planet, and we're still losing about net 10 to 15 billion trees per year globally. It's different, quite different here in North America, but these are global numbers, and these have incredible impacts on the lives of people around the world. We've also found through some research at the World Economic Forum that over half of our global GDP, about $44 trillion, is dependent on nature, and we're rapidly losing that. But we also know that we can restore forests and benefit society and the environment. So some research that we look at found that we can create about $10 trillion in business opportunity and about 395 million jobs by 2030 by reinvesting in nature, alongside all of these other benefits around livelihoods, mental health, which we've probably all learned during the global pandemic as we re-embrace the nature right in our backyards, treasure trove of innovation and important services that nature provides for us. And so the Trillium Trees platform is really founded on the fact that of the 3 trillion trees that we've lost, we can actually conserve and restore another 1 trillion of those and benefit society all over the world. And so we've created this global movement to bring together this disparate effort and encourage many more into this space to conserve, restore, and grow trees in that order specifically. This is our fancy theory of change, but our work generally breaks down into 3 areas. So the World Economic Forum has entered this space because we recognize that while governments have played a really key role in this, the private sector has begun to jump in, but really hasn't jumped in with 2 feet. And so we see a big part of our work is the ability to engage the private sector across all sectors and show them the way forward into conservation and restoration of nature. And we really think that trees are a really great hook. People get it. Every age group, every demographic, everyone loves trees. And so we can use trees as the way to get folks to care more about forests and biodiversity and ecosystem services and beyond. And so we think there's ways that we can bring in new tools and metrics and methodologies to accelerate the role of the corporate sector. The second area is around priority regions. So here in the US, we've launched our US chapter. I can speak a little bit more to that. It was the first chapter to launch, but it will kick off multiple other chapters across OneT. We're currently working on launching the Amazon Basin, the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa to support the Great Green Wall across Africa. Both of those are very focused on developing the bioeconomy in those regions to really benefit local communities. And then we'll be launching chapters in India and China over the coming year as well. And in each of these regions, we're really trying to find where we can play a role and where the World Economic Forum coming in can help accelerate action to benefit all, and finding ecopreneurs, which is the key third pillar. So this is all around harnessing the innovation and the skill sets of folks around the world, techie folks who want to sort of play their part on various environmental and social issues through our platform called Uplink at the World Economic Forum. We can crowdsource these cool new innovative solutions to these areas. And so we've been running a whole series of ecopreneurship challenges through Trillium Trees. So I mentioned our US chapter was the first to launch. We launched here in the US last August. We had bipartisan support from elected officials at all levels of government, and we had quite a lot of support from companies, from NGOs, from civil society, and from states and cities as well. So we launched with 28 pledges as our first wave. We're now over 50 pledges through the US chapter, which collectively add up to over 49.3 billion trees. Around conservation, restoration, and growing trees. And we also are attracting all these pledges of what we're calling enabling actions, of which SFI has pledged one of them, which are things like workforce development, nursery capacity, technology tools, financial tools, all the other things we know we need to bring into this space to enable our work towards Trillion Trees, but maybe don't specifically count towards a tree count. The US chapter is co-led with our friends at American Forest, so a double shout out to the great work that they do. And we're led through our Stakeholder Council, sort of keeps us honest. And then we've been developing a whole series of working groups through our community of practice focused on issues specifically relevant here in the US and very timely. We have an ongoing working group around carbon finance, another that just met yesterday on reforestation, a lot of what Darren was speaking about climate resilient reforestation and ensuring that we're taking into account all the important issues around right tree, right place, right community, et cetera. We are kicking off our urban and community forestry working group soon, and then a US policy working group, and communications are in the works as well. So I encourage you to visit our us.1t.org website to see all the pledges and see if you'd like to participate in the US chapter. We'll take pledges from anyone across any sector if you're based in the US or are working to support US forestry. Our US Stakeholder Council, as I mentioned, is incredibly diverse. We're really proud of the diversity of elected officials we have at all levels of government. So we have USDA and USAID represented at the federal level. We have corporations, we have NGOs, we have civil society groups, and it's a really nice diverse mix. We also have youth represented who really, really keep us honest by making sure that we're all moving forward faster together. So through the US chapter, as I mentioned, we've been collecting pledges. I wanted to pull out just 3 examples of the corporate pledges we've received. These are alongside things like the Girl Scouts and the city of Dallas, and the urban foresters groups. But we've been trying to identify all the ways that companies are showing up in this space at the beginning. And so these are just 3 examples. We have MasterCard, who has their Priceless Planet Coalition to restore 100 million trees through all these, they have about 50 corporate partners, and then they're using the payment services platform to engage customers towards this 100 million tree goal. Then we have Bank of America, which has committed $300 billion in mobilizing capital towards nature-based solutions to climate change. And this includes a lot of work on scaling up carbon markets. And they think that they see their role as an ability to enable these markets to scale faster. They're also doing a lot of investments in urban forestry in regions in which they have operations. And then we have a third example of Microsoft, who has a really ambitious greenhouse gas emissions goal. They're going to halve their emissions. And then they're working on investing in emissions removals to compensate for the existing emissions in their profile that they haven't yet been able to reduce, both current, future, and also historically all the way back to their corporate founding. And so in this space, they're investing in carbon dioxide removal. Many of them come from natural solutions right now. And this is the third way that we're seeing companies show up in this. And these are not exhaustive, but these are just three examples we've pulled from our US working groups. And so we've sort of collected these corporate examples globally. And as we've launched our corporate alliance, which is our leading list of companies who join us every month to sort of learn from each other and share best practices and ideas, these are sort of the ways that we're seeing companies realize that they have a really important role to play in conservation and restoration. So I won't read them out, but we're seeing these companies find this as a way to show leadership, to reach their net zero targets in a credible way, to work not just in eliminating the causes of driving deforestation, but to then invest in conservation and restoration of those degraded lands, and to really start to build trust, because they, like us, realize that trees are a great way to connect to customers, to employees, to communities in which they're operating. And I had a company tell me, like, it's really hard to get warm and fuzzy about carbon emissions, but I can get folks to care about trees. And it's a really nice hook, and it's a really nice way that we can engage with our customers and employees, and then get them more excited about all of the bigger bigger greenhouse gas and biodiversity and water goals that we have. So at our global level, our corporate alliance works with companies across all sectors. Some of them don't seem like they would be obvious players in the forestry sector, but each one has a way that they're seeing their company play in this space, and they're really important to learn from each other, so that when they're developing RFPs or when they're investing in new projects, they're sort of considering all of the socio and economic considerations, and that they're ensuring that they're showing up in the best way possible. So to be part of our corporate alliance, we wanted to make sure we had some groundwork so that companies aren't sort of just investing in carbon emissions or in carbon offsets at the expense of their other goals, and that we're really trying to stay away from any kind of claims of greenwashing that could be imagined. So we've worked really closely with our corporate alliance members to set these level playing field expectations. Any company that joins our corporate alliance has to commit to applying ecologically and socially responsible approaches. A lot of them Darren articulated, and there's many other groups working on identifying all of the metrics and the indicators that we need to be acknowledging when we're and tracking as we're investing in these projects. They need to be committed to forest positive approaches, so not just investing in conservation, but also in avoiding deforestation from their own operations and their supply chains. So it has to be a full suite approach. And then all the companies have to have committed to a science-based target or a net zero target to make sure that they're working on reducing their own impact on climate change while investing in nature-based solutions. This is not an either or, this is an and. Many companies are not using their investments in conservation towards their climate goals, and that's fine. They can do it for a wide variety of reasons, but they need to be doing it as well. And we're pretty clear on that. I also wanted to mention that specific to the forest sector, we are partners in a really exciting project around the use of engineered wood products. I know that's probably a topic of many of your other webinars. So I just wanted to put a quick plug for this specific work stream that OneT is working on, which is around the opportunity around structural wood, engineered wood products across all sectors. We recognize that this shows up in quite a few of the other programs across the World Economic Forum, such as our work on biodiverse cities and urban sustainability. And we want to make sure that we're connecting all the dots between these important programs. And so you might have heard of the Climate Smart Forest Economy Program. The World Economic Forum and OneT are one of the many players working on the various work streams of this. Specific to this program, we're working on driving the corporate sector uptake of it. So we're working on finding companies across a whole variety of sectors who are either supporting the use of CLT or investing in projects and sort of creating a demand signal for this work. So if you want more information about that, feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with our colleague leading that work. So I mentioned that we, at OneT.org, we sort of have these examples. We have this hypothesis that there's a role for the private sector, but we didn't have a way to sort of identify it systematically. So we've been working with our friends at Dahlberg Consulting on this report that releases this Friday. So you're getting a sneak peek of it right now on the business case for investing in forests. So we wanted to look across all sectors, like I mentioned, globally at where the corporate sector is playing in this space and why they're investing in forests. We boiled it down to three main areas that we see as beginning to be emerging, but to really be growing. So the first area is companies across all sectors realize that there's business resilience to be found here. As Darren mentioned, trees and forests and healthy ecosystems are great protectors of the impacts of climate change. The value that nature provides is increasingly being able to be quantified, and we don't pay enough till we lose it, and then we pay a lot to replace it. So companies are realizing that by investing in forests, they're building resilience for their operations and their supply chains. They're also realizing that there's actually profitability and growth to be found here. By investing in forests, they're finding lower costs of capital and equity, increased customer loyalty, increased investor interest, and actually, if they're at all in the wood products or the forest products sectors, there's actual great value to be found here by managing forests sustainably. And finally, companies are realizing that there's values-based leadership. The World Economic Forum has done a lot of work on stakeholder capitalism and this idea of longer-term value creation beyond quarterly returns that the most leading companies are being rewarded for in the marketplaces. And so collectively, there's been research showing that intact forests and their ecosystem services actually provide $150 trillion in value, which is twice the value of the global stock exchanges. And the most leading companies are starting to grasp that value. So we did a deeper dive analysis with Dahlberg across those 3 areas, through supply chains, through customers, through relationships, and we found all sorts of examples of ways that companies are reducing risk and realizing value from investing in forests. We also looked at what types of interventions they found that are the best solutions on climate. This sort of matches a lot of what Darren was talking about as well here in the North American context. But we found that of the emissions reduction or the abatement potential of forests as sort of solutions to capturing carbon on climate and helping mitigate climate change, about 60% of the ability for forests globally is from avoidance. So conserving the old growth forests that we already have. And then about 40% is from restoration opportunities to restore degraded lands and plant and grow new trees. And so we wanted to help break it down for companies so that when they're creating a portfolio approach, they can invest in all the best ways. And we're not promoting a race to the bottom, but we're actually investing in the highest quality projects. When companies are entering this space, we sort of have a hierarchy of how we think that they should be entering. So the best way that they can be working is if they're working in-house. So if your company has land holdings or has owns forested lands, or in your supply chain, there are lands that either are forested or could be forested or used to be forested, the best way to start is to invest in in-house work through your own operations and your value chains to provide the best economic opportunities. The next best way that companies can show up is by leveraging their existing tools to support this broader work. So these are the areas where companies can use their technology solutions, their financial mechanisms, their employees, their educational platforms, to find all sorts of ways that they can support this broader ecosystem. And then where these 2 options are not feasible, the next final best thing is to invest in financial offset mechanisms around conservation and restoration, where you're at least providing financial capital to support the projects, even if you're not able to take them on yourself. So we wanted to break this down by companies. And so we looked across 3 different bucketed areas of types of archetypes of companies and how they're showing up. So we looked at companies that actually source products from forests or source products that drive impacts on forests. We looked at companies that have a low dependency on forests, but have a high potential to support. And then we looked at companies that have really high emissions profiles that are heavy emitting and have hard to abate footprints. And I'm not going to go into details, please read the report. But in the first category, those companies that have a high dependency on forests, these are companies either in the forestry sector or in the food product sector, apparel sector, health, or even tourism sectors that have a dependency on forests. We did some case studies looking at Nestle, which is doing co-investments with their suppliers to avoid deforestation and conserve the lands where they're sourcing some of their commodities. And then we did a profile of Suzano, the Brazilian paper and pulp company, which has about 40% of their lands in permanent conservation, and they had this mosaic planting techniques. So we sort of in the report identify all the ways that companies that have a direct impact on forests can show up in an important way in this space. We then looked at companies that have a low dependency on forests, but high potential to support the solutions. So these are companies in things like the financial sector, the technology sector, insurance, who haven't really played a role in this work to date. We did a profile of Salesforce, which has a 100 million tree pledge, and they're doing a lot of work on employee engagement as well as implementation of technology solutions. And then we did a profile of Rabobank, which has an Agri3 fund, which is working on financial mechanisms to support restoration and conservation. And then finally, we did a focus on companies with high emissions profiles. These are the ones where you might hear some worries of greenwashing because they're heavily invested in nature-based solutions, but we need to make sure that they're also balancing that with decarbonization of their portfolio. And in this case, we did a really interesting profile of Shell, which has $100 million investments in nature-based solutions and has a whole team working on making sure that there's really strong environmental and social metrics and analysis involved in the projects that they're supporting to focus on the credibility of the nature-based solutions within their larger portfolio. So going down a bit of a wonky rabbit hole for just a few minutes where I'm running out of time, I wanted to give a quick overview of nature-based solutions because we think this is an area where we're seeing incredible growth. We've seen over 1,400 companies globally commit to setting science-based targets. About half of them have been approved by the ScienceBased Targets Initiative. And as we run up to the COP26 in Glasgow, we're seeing that companies are moving beyond science-based targets and setting net zero goals. And so the Science-Based Targets Initiative has put out some really nice guidance as they have their consultation on what this means. So just briefly, the red line is the sort of business as usual. If companies just go along with their emissions as they've been. If they set a science-based target, it means that they've committed to reduce their emissions along their part of the global budget as determined by this SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so the blue line would show the emissions reductions over time, usually about 3 to 5% per year compounding depending on their sector. But this still leaves some emissions. And so the idea with net zero is that you would then invest in either insetting in your own footprint or an offsetting through financial mechanisms, the green area, to invest in a similar amount of emissions abatement from nature-based solutions or engineered solutions as they come online at a price point that's competitive. And so in this way, you're not using your investments in nature to sort of pretend you don't have emissions or to zero them out, but you're compensating for them over time as you reach a temporary state of carbon neutrality where they're balanced towards a state of net zero, where it's been determined that you've reduced your emissions as much as possible and you're investing in emissions removals to sort of keep those in complete balance. So these are some more slides just showing this sort of trajectory of reducing emissions and investing in emissions reductions. And we see this as a really important distinction where companies are able to do both. They can reduce their emissions and invest in conservation and restoration. And in this way, they can sort of help to jumpstart the investments that we need. We all know it takes a long time, as Darren said, depending on how far north you are in latitudes, it takes a long time from when you plant a tree until it's beginning to really capture its optimal amount of carbon. And so we want to have companies be jumpstarting these emissions now while they're decarbonizing and not waiting for one or the other. So if you're really interested in net zero, like I am, these are two resources I recommend you look out to. The Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets is led by Mark Carney, working to compile this information globally to ensure that the standards that we're setting for global carbon markets are robust and considering all these important areas. And then my colleagues at the forum are working on this Nature and Net Zero project to help sort of contextualize these two areas, as I was mentioning, and making sure that we're addressing all the areas within carbon markets to scale up faster. This is all part of this road to Glasgow, as I mentioned, and into next year. And so everything that the OneT.org team is doing is helping to show the role of the private sector in this area and making sure that we're taking these robust standards and this sort of messaging into these important global meetings so that the rules of the road are considered and we're all scaling up faster. If you want to learn more, we are launching the report I was just talking about this Friday as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration launch. So I encourage you to visit our website and visit our social media to get the live stream of the report launch and the launch of the OneT Corporate Alliance, and there'll be much more ahead after that. So with that, I will wrap and hand it back to Lauren, who will probably have some questions for both of us, and looking forward to learning more from everyone on the line.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Betty. You covered some really interesting context there. I know many of us have seen the OneT.org work, but it's really nice to see a little bit more under the hood of all the things that you're focusing on. So really appreciate that. I'm going to ask Daphne, could you take over the screen, or maybe I can take it back. We don't need to put anything up. I'm going to go to just like speaker view here. But there we go. Yeah, so maybe we could ask a couple of questions to wrap up here. We have just about 10 minutes. We've gotten some really interesting questions. I thought I could start off with a question for each of you about the idea of assurances. And so Darren, for your side, I wonder if you could add a little more context about, you shared a lot of great information on carbon and climate and how that's changing within SFI. Could you give us a little insight on how the consumers of certified wood products might be changing their interest in certified sustainable products, and how SFI, is that part of how SFI is responding? Are they responding to this interest in carbon or being net neutral or carbon neutral or net zero? Or is this driven from the forestry sector? Could you just give us a little more insight from your perspective? Oh, you're on mute, Darren. Yeah.
I almost made it through a meeting without someone saying you're on mute. Essentially what we're seeing is it's really right across the value chain. We are seeing increasing customer demand. We are seeing an increasing interest and willingness to buy that product that has that label on it that suggests it is sustainably sourced. So we are seeing an increasing, I don't know if it's really being driven by, I don't know if it's really driving up costs at this point, but there is an interest in seeing that logo. And at an equal cost, consumers would prefer to buy the product with the logo on it. So there is that at least a little bit of awareness of what's going on. But again, we're seeing it right across the value chain. We're seeing certified organizations that are interested in providing that assurance. We've long known that if you're managing your forest, you're ensuring that forest gets regrown, you're doing good things for the climate. There's an increasing interest in communicating that out and telling that story up and down the value chain. And again, we're seeing it all the way at the top from the investors, from folks like BlackRock who've come out and said, if you're not considering climate change and carbon in your operations, we're not going to invest in you. So we're seeing it right across the board. So the interest within our certified organizations to do this work, to represent it with good solid science and data has been paramount. And that's what we've done. If anyone wants to question that assurance of SFI, is SFI actually providing this value, talk to us. We can show you the data. We're not making this up. As a scientist, and that wasn't perhaps clear in my introduction, but I'm a forest ecologist by training. I spent way too much time in school doing all those crazy academic things. I personally am not comfortable with me saying something or someone else saying something. Show me the data, and we've got the data to show that.
So thanks for that, Darren. And Betty, in your case, could you elaborate? You shared a number of examples of companies that are engaging with you, making different types of targets and commitments, and supporting OneT.org directly. Could you just say a little bit about the types of assurances, the range of assurances that those companies are looking at? So some are looking at like carbon offsets, others are maybe donating money as part of corporate social responsibility. Could you just, is that the gamut, or what are you seeing generally in that space? And you covered some examples. I just thought I'd circle around.
Yeah, it's a great point. So we've started with pledges because it's sort of the ticket in the door. If you want to be part of our working groups and learn from your peers and share ideas, we want to make sure each entity has something on the table. And so for some of those pledges, it is in terms of pledge towards trees, or money towards nature-based solutions, or carbon removal commitments, or as I mentioned, sort of all these other ways that companies are showing up with technology and financing mechanisms and education. Actually, education is our number one most popular way that companies are pledging. But we understand that pledges are it's just, so what did I hear? A pledge is a dream with an end date. Like, it's really just a sort of commitment towards the future. It's all about implementation. So all the work we do through our working groups is to really focus on implementation and credible and responsible implementation. And we're actually working with quite a few of the most leading NGOs who are all developing different systems for tracking implementation of restoration, to bring them together to harness their best strengths, to ensure that and ensure that when they're developing these systems of implementation and tracking mechanisms, they're considering the role of the corporate sector and what data the corporate sector can provide, and what they need to understand that their investments are making progress over time. That the trees are still standing and growing, but also that the carbon benefits, the economic and social benefits that they had invested in are playing out as anticipated, or actually maybe even better. And so we're working on bringing together, you'll hear an announcement on Friday, so spilling the beans a little bit, but the WRI, Restore from the Crowther Lab, and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, as well as the IUCN Restoration Barometer, will all be coming together to create this ecosystem where all sorts of entities who are investing in restoration projects can upload shape files and can use these geospatial tools and open source tracking tools along with standardized metrics to make sure that they're all sort of putting data into a central place and receiving and tracking their progress, and that there's transparency and accountability, because we think that a lot of companies are hesitant to invest in the space if they aren't able to track their progress, especially if it's a financial contribution, and then, you know, what happened to the trees? There's a lot of risk. There are a lot of reports out that are sort of attacking companies for just making financial contributions and claims. And we really want to make sure that there is transparency, and we have such great tools. So a lot of what OneT is doing is to sort of harness this collective demand signal to work with our partners to provide the tools and services for all of us to benefit from. So watch for more information on that later this week.
That's helpful, Betty. And so to kind of get to another kind of framing of that, to just deal with some of the sensitive, and I know this is like a bigger probably topic that we wouldn't have time to unpack completely, but Darren, I thought maybe I could give you a chance to respond to some of the concerns about, you know, the concern about like greenwashing or dealing with addressing sensitive habitats or sensitive areas like old growth, which, you know, I know does have already, before the new revisions, had specific language in standards. So I was wondering if you, and boreal forests and things, I was just wondering if you could just address that at a really high level, or maybe we could link to some additional resources in the recording, but just thought maybe you could give you a chance to respond to some of that.
That's a fair point, Lauren. So I'm going to start with saying, I'm going to give you the quick answer about, does SFI deal with old growth forests? The answer is yes, unequivocally yes, but it's a lot more complicated than that. When you think about, again, thinking from an ecological science perspective, what old growth is varies significantly by where you are standing in North America. So if you're standing in the Pacific Northwest, it's these giant, massive trees that can be 600-800 years old. If you're standing in the boreal forest, there are parts of the boreal forest where an ancient forest would be 110 years old. So it really depends on where you're standing. If you're in the Southeast, anything past 25 years is probably considered ancient. You know, it depends on where you are in the continent. So keep that in mind. The way SFI specifically addresses old growth within the standard is number one, and this applies anywhere in North America, wherever you're standing. We have a strict requirement that you follow all legal requirements. So whatever the current management paradigm in your neighborhood is that you've got to follow, you have to follow that, number one. But of course, we have to go beyond that, but that does apply to all forest managers and companies and organizations across the board. Once you get past that, the standard does require the protection of old growth forests. When you identify old growth that is old growth, and you've done the work to figure that out, or you're relying on your current scientists, you know, in the area to help you figure that out, because it's not always an easy question, that there's a requirement to maintain old growth percentages on your landscape. There's beyond that, we also talk about, because old growth isn't just old trees, it's actually ecosystems that display what we call old growth attributes. So there's a requirement for the maintenance of old growth attributes or values at the landscape scale. There is a prohibition on reforesting with species that may be adverse to those old growth values and those attributes. And then of course, there's also a requirement to support and participate in programs for the conservation of old growth forests. So all that is within the standard and baked in. So that's the simple answer to that one, is that we do care about old growth, and that's an important component of long-term sustainable forest management. Now, to get back to the sort of the broader question of greenwashing, my first response to that is I would invite any organization who feels strongly that SFI is somehow engaged in greenwashing, look at the standard, look at what we do as an organization, look at the forest management that takes place in our lands. Don't just believe the propaganda that's out there, but dig in, look at what we do, talk to us. It is not greenwashing, it is far from it. It is conservation of the highest order. And I, as a scientist, I have no problem with stating that. What we often find is the folks who say, oh, greenwashing, and then they reference something, they're either referencing themselves or they're referencing a report from 30 years ago. Look at SFI now. This is, what was that old ad? This is not your father's Cadillac. Well, this is not your father's SFI, that you're not your grandfather's certification scheme. This is, SFI has grown much more and is doing much, much more now than it ever did, 25, 30 years ago. So that's how I would address those comments. And I did notice, finally in the Q&A, one of the questions asked about specific critics of forest certification and were they involved with the standard revision process? You saw the numbers I talked about the number of people involved with our revision process, both in terms of being on committees as well as providing comments and participating in webinars. The standard for getting into our process to be involved was essentially 2 feet and a heartbeat and a willingness to find solutions. So we let, our committees, some of those committees were not tiny groups of, selected 10 people. We had one committee that I believe was about 45 people. If you could show up and you had ideas and you wanted to help, you were welcome. We put no restrictions on anyone. So that's the first thing. And we advertised that broad and wide. That's how come we had such good participation. And then in terms of participation in the webinars and providing comments, and yes, many of those groups, including the NRDC, provided comments on the SFI standard, the revised standard rather. We have an external review panel of forestry experts who reviews all of those comments that come in and make sure that SFI addresses them appropriately. So that's all done. So it's quadruple assured in that sense. So if anyone did not participate in the SFI revision process, it is because they either were unaware, which would be pretty hard to do, or unwilling to be helpful and participate.
So Darren, thanks for that context, and maybe we can also add some links. I know there's some information coming out about the standard revision, and so maybe we could just add some helpful links to the recording for folks that would like to learn more. So maybe we can.
You want to put those into the chat, perhaps?
Oh well, if you want, yeah, you could drop anything into the chat, but we can also post it with the recording of the webinar. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I would say is if you go to our website, there's all the information on the standard revision process. There's versions of the standard with like track changes in it. There's clean versions of the standard, all the different components, all of it's there and publicly available.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I know we are going over a few minutes, but it is our last webinar of the series. And I think we're really getting to some, me working in this space, it's getting to the root of some really fundamental questions about what is the role of the bioeconomy in terms of meeting the climate challenge, both in planting trees and maintaining forests, but also in sustainable wood products. So it is really helpful to take an extra minute to understand your perspective and a little more on the process that went into that. And so I guess since we are a couple minutes over, if I can ask you both just kind of one bigger question, where do you see this all going in the next couple of years in your respective organizations? Darren, you've just completed a revision. Do you see further advancements, towards defining climate smart, what that means for certification, or, just not to give you ideas, but where do you see that going? And then Betty, where do you see things going? This quest for addressing climate change, carbon neutrality. What does this all mean? Do you see your numbers growing or further refining these platforms? What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years for both of you? Maybe I'll start with you, Betty, since Darren just shared.
Sure. So, in 10 years, I hope we're at 1 trillion trees, which is a very large number. Our close to 50 billion tree mark will put us at about 5%. And that's just pledged numbers, and that's just from the US. So I look forward to seeing much more contributions from other countries. It's kind of fun to have an area where the US is actually leading much of the world in this space, especially as policies come into play at the federal level, as well as subnational levels that are really aligned with the way that companies are entering the space. So really excited to see public-private partnerships take off in a big way. And on the corporate side, I see a lot more companies looking to nature-based solutions as a key part of their net zero portfolio, as I mentioned, not the only part, but a key aspect. But as more companies enter who don't have expertise in this area, there's going to be a lot of hesitation from them on making sure that they're not opening themselves up to additional risk by making these investments. And so they're going to be looking to the implementing partners to really be better tracking the growth of trees over time, the carbon reductions and sequestration, the social and economic benefits, the other environmental benefits. And so I see a lot more scrutiny coming and a lot more need for data and tracking and accountability at a local level, as well as at a geospatial global level. And I see the way that technology and blockchain and drones and satellites and markets are all going to come into this space to hopefully help us all sort of see what's happening on the ground and scale it faster and have more confidence in that. So heads up, companies want to play, and they want to know what they're investing in and that their investments really are doing as promised. So that's where I see this space going.
Great, thanks, Betty. Darren?
I think if we look at an evolution of forest management and forest management organizations over the last, say, 30 years, we've gone from first organizations who are only concerned about getting wood to the mill to organizations that really started thinking about limiting negative aspects, limiting risk on that side. But now we're into this awesome space where a lot of organizations are now starting to think about touting the benefits and really maximizing the benefits of ecosystem services, understanding that the forest sector is part of the nature-based solution. They're not just like a company that's wondering how they can get engaged with nature-based solutions. They are the nature-based solutions. And I think I'm seeing companies that are keen to talk about this, to think about this, and how do I do more, and what
No.
my risk, but I can also push those benefits. So there's a lot of positivity there. And what Betty said about technology and drones and Landsat imaging and all these new technologies that are coming online to make that job more realistic and more possible is fantastic. So we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm. We're seeing a lot of people that are anxious to just get going on this.
Well, that's great. Really appreciate those closing thoughts. And really big thank you to both of you, to Darren and Betty, for the time you put in preparing your presentations and the time that you shared with us today. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and for those that have joined any session in our lineup this year, the 2020-2021 lineup. We'll be in touch with new information on this soon. But again, thanks to our speakers. Really appreciate the time and the insights, and we'll see you all in the fall. So everyone have a great summer and a great afternoon, and take care till then. Thank you so much.